Joe Mixon is a bounce back candidate. And we probably wouldn't have been saying this a month or two ago because his ADP was dropping. He was a cut candidate. There were questions of whether he would be replaced in the draft with maybe a Zach Charbonnet or some other running back. But for right now, Joe Mixon is on the Bengals. And there is not a viable number two that we are trusting. Maybe it's Travion Williams. Maybe it's someone else. But for right now, Joe Mixon is going to be the lead back for the Cincinnati Bengals. And he was a player who last year was expected to score over 10 touchdowns per PFF, only scored 7 despite having a 5-touchdown game. And then he was also expected to have 19 fantasy points a game. He was only at 17. This is a player that we expected huge things from him, and just there were some efficiency metrics. Maybe he was dealing with underlying injuries. Maybe there were other things going on. But with a firmer view and better information about what is going to be Joe Mixon's role here in 2023 for the Cincinnati Bengals, we need to be more in on a bounce back for Joe Mixon, especially given his, 5th round ADP still?
Yeah, Mixon really was his season last year is basically the tale of two halves. We'll get into that here in a second. But his offseason has been probably even more interesting than his actual season last year. We're talking about those legal concerns. A gunshot went off there. We talked about that. That dropped his ADP. Then we talked about the Bengals cap situation that they're going to have to pay T. Higgins. They're going to have to pay Joe Burrow. Eventually, they're going to have to pay Jamar Chase. There's not enough money to go around for Joe Mixon. So there was talk that Mixon could be on his way out. You mentioned Travion Williams. Chase Brown was drafted. And there was actually talk during the playoffs and whatnot and through part of the season that maybe Samaje Perine was a better fit in this Bengals offense than Mixon. But let's not make no mistake about it. This Bengals offense is a pass-first offense. Now, I'm really not sure if Mixon really needs to bounce back. He ended up being that RB9 on a points per game basis, averaging that 15.9. He was RB12 on the season in PPR, despite missing 2 contests. He had double-digit fantasy production in 3 of the final 4 games. That all being said, he had a pad statter game there against the Carolina Panthers where he had those 5 touchdowns, 4 on the ground, caught 5 passes for 58 yards, 153 yards on the ground on 22 attempts. Prior to that game against Carolina, Mixon was only averaging 3.3 yards per carry. That's the first half of the season. If you invested I think you probably invested in him, you were probably a very upset individual. And I'm using that term very lightly. Now, when you look at that after that week 8 game, I think it was PFF that had Mixon as the second highest graded running back, averaging 16.7 fantasy points per game when he was healthy, and that's including the playoff run. Mixon finished 6th in touches per game at 19.5, second in carry. This is the big one for me. Although he didn't finish any of them, the Bengals still trusted him inside the 10-yard line with 28 carries, and that's from weeks 1 through 17. He only scored 5 touchdowns, like you mentioned, but he factored into the passing game. And this is where it's key for me because we mentioned that this Bengals offense is a passing unit. I want players on a good offense, especially when their running backs catching 60 passes for 441 yards. If that volume in that passing game continues and Mixon can find a way into the end zone, a top 10 finish is well within the realms of possibilities here.
Yeah, we saw a floor last year, like for at least half of the season. And if that's what a half of a floor season is going to give you for Joe Mixon, we need to be a little bit more bullish on drafting him. I know there are some legal concerns that need to be addressed, but just like the Alvin Kamara, this might be the Alvin Kamara scenario playing out yet again, where we hear rumblings about legal issues in the offseason, and then his ADP plummets, and then he plays the whole season. And it's not until the following season that things are addressed. So maybe that is the pathway for Joe Mixon. That remains to be seen.